Chapter 7. The Wormy Spaghetti. The next day, to pay back Mr. Twit for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose the long, big ones and put them in the tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce, and she sprinkled it with cheese.
"Hey, my spaghetti's moving!" cried Mr. Twit, poking around with it with his fork.
"Well, it's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms on. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating and twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "I think it's really tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching from the other end of the table, and it gave her great pleasure to watch him eating the worms. "I find it a bit bitter," Mr. Twit said. "Yes, it's got a bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful of spaghetti, and then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. "Yes, why?" he said.
"And you want to know why it had a nasty bitter taste?" "Yes, why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with a horrible laughter.
Chapter 8. The Funny Walking Stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in the spaghetti, Mr. Twit had to think up a really nasty trick. One night when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his shed. There, he stuck a tiny piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick.
Now this made the stick a bit longer, but the difference was so small that the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice it.
The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another bit of wood, and every night he crept downstairs and he added extra tiny thickness to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that they actually looked like part of the stick. Gradually, so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it is almost impossible to notice it. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It's the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was so slow and gradual, she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Oh, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was."
"Yes, there's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said. "Why, whatever do you think it is? This stick, it must have been getting longer."
"Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick have grown longer? It's made out of dead wood. Dead wood can't grow." "Then what has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, it's you," cried Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you. You're getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "Yeah, you're a shrinking woman," said Mr. Twit. "It's not possible." "Yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast, dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never," she cried. Of course you have. Look at your stick, you old goat. Look how much you've shrunk in comparison to that. You've got the shrinks is what you've got. Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly that she had to sit down.
Chapter 9. Mrs. Twit has the shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much that your feet aren't even touching the ground anymore." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground.
Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he had been with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he had done the same to the 4 legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting in the same chair," he cried. "You've shrank so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger like a pistol. "You've got them so badly. The most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she even began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and then your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of clothes." "I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "Oh, it's a terrible disease," cried Mr. Twit. "The worst one ever." "Oh, how long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. "Isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit. Tell me quickly," she cried. "We'll have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready. I'll do anything you ask," cried Mrs. Twit. "'Cause you won't last long if you don't do it," cried Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What have I got to do?" clutching her cheeks. "You have got to be stretched." Chapter 10. Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outside, where he had everything ready for a great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string, and he had a gas cylinder for filling up the balloons. He fixed an iron ring into the ground. "You stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring, and then he tied her ankles to the iron ring in the floor. When that was done, he began filling the 100 balloons with gas. Each balloon was then tied on a long string, and when it was filled with gas and pulling on its string, it was trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the string to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he even tied around her neck and her arms, to her wrists, and even some to her hair. And soon there were 50 balloons floating in the air high above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons, and the upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now, and with her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was like a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If these strings around my ankles break, then it'll be goodbye for me." And that is what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Chapter 11. Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit had cried. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "Oh, what a ghastly thought! We don't want anything like that to happen, do we? Dear no. No, we most certainly wouldn't, cried Mrs. Twit. Put some more strings around my ankles quickly. I want to feel really safe. Oh, yes, very well, my angel, said Mr. Twit, with a ghoulish grin. He knelt down at her feet and took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the rings, tying Mrs. Twit's ankles to the ring in the ground.
She went up like a rocket. Help! She screamed. Save me! But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds she was high in the blue sky and climbing fast, and Mr. Twit stood below looking up. Oh, what a pretty sight, he said to himself. How lovely those balloons look in the sky, and what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last this old hag has gone forever.
Chapter 12. Mrs. Twit comes ballooning back down again. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up in the sky she had a bright idea. If I can get rid of some of these balloons, she said to herself, I will stop going up and I'll start coming back down again. She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists, her arms, her neck and her hair. And each time she bit through a string and let a balloon float away, the upward pull got less and less, and at her rate of climb had slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether and just stayed still, floating in the air. She bit through one more string, and very slowly she began to float downwards. It was a very calm day, and there was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone straight up, and now began to come straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight and a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary woman. Chapter 13. Mr. Twit gets a horrid shock. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his ugly wife for the very last time, was sat in his garden celebrating. Suddenly, Mrs. Twit came floating down, and when she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out,
Here I come, you grizzly old grunion, you rotten old turnip and you filthy old frumpet. Mr. Twit jumped as though he'd been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer and he looked up. He gaped, he gasped, he gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. He said, I will get you for this, shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she'd somehow managed to hang on to the whole time. I will swish you to a swizzle, she shouted. I will swish you to a swizzle. And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, the bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with the stick and cracking him all over his body.